I am, make sure that that's on. If not, I'm going to have to get louder. This morning we're going to be looking at the Old Testament. If you have a Bible with you, we're going to start with Genesis chapter 37, and it goes all the way to 50. So I'm not going to do a verse by verse, kind of like reading, or we'd be here probably till like Tuesday. So I'm going to kind of stop at different parts, and we're going to be talking about Joseph this morning. So if you know the beginning of the Bible, kind of going back even past, we're going to fast forward just a little bit. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You've probably heard that before. After Jacob has 12 sons, and one of those sons is Joseph. And that's where we're going to pick up in our story this morning. The reason why that's important is because if you go to the beginning of Matthew and all the begats, remember it's like so-and-so begat so-and-so. Joseph is a great part of the genealogy of Jesus, because Joseph's brother Judah is a direct descendant of Jesus. And so that's why it's important this morning that we know the Old Testament. Have you ever had a dream and the destination isn't exactly what it was advertised? I don't know if you've ever had those kind of dreams. I know when you're young, you have all these ideas about what life is going to be like and where you're headed. I'm going to tell you a story, and this started out, we thought in our house at the time we had dogs and cats. I don't know how many of you have animals in your house. We had a foolish idea to take the cat on a road trip. Now, for those of you who know, dogs travel well, cats don't. Now, I was young and we didn't totally understand this. So we put the cat in the back seat and we're driving on the road, and we're miles from our house. We're miles from civilization. We're on the road, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, but the cat had projectile diarrhea. Okay, and it was in the back seat. It was aimed somehow. It aimed its rear towards the front, and the back of the seats, the front seats were covered. The windshield had stuff on it. Even the rear view mirror had on it. And we're like, we have got to stop and clean this up. This is a mess. And so we looked, and we keep driving. There's no gas station. There's no cat cleanup area. There's nothing. And so we finally find a rest stop. Now, what I'm about to tell you, you're going to realize, because we get out and it's my job to clean the car. I got the easy job. And then my friend who was in the car went in and took the cat into the rest area. Now, what happened next, I learned after the fact, and I'm glad I wasn't in there because it took me a while to clean. What happened was they took the cat in and they took it to the sink. And if you know, the sinks now in the rest stops, they don't use the turn anymore. What do? You have these things where you go like this, right? The water sprays out. So they had taken the cat and were going like this, and it was just spraying every so often on the cat, and it was wild. And the cat was getting partially wet, partially angry at this point, and wasn't getting fully dunked, and it still had stuff on it. So, where's the other place in the bathroom where you have lots of water? So they took the cat in to where the toilet was and dunked him, and he got baptized, so he's going to heaven. That's the good news. They took the cat, and now he's fully dunked. His ears are fully down. He's looking like, if you do anything else to me, and he didn't know what else was about to happen. So they get out of the toilet, and they're looking for a place to dry him off. But guess what? There's no paper towels anymore. They got rid of paper towels. What do they have? They have air dryers. So the cat now, as long as they could hold it upright while it was warm, they dried it off. When I see it, when it comes back in the car, its hair standing up, its ears are down, and it's got this low growl, like. So we ended up, the cat stayed underneath the seat the rest of the time and glared at us like, the minute you get to where we're going, I'm out of the car. Sometimes when you start out, you think it's going to go one way, and then it takes a side route, doesn't it? Sometimes life is like that. You think it's going to go one way, and then it goes a complete other way. In Genesis chapter 37, Jacob is the dad, and he has these sons. And we know that his youngest son was his favorite. And that becomes a problem in of itself, because he gives this son, his favorite son, and it says in verse 3, "Now Israel, who's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons." Now, if you've ever been in a family, what kind of problems happen when someone is loved more than the others, right? That is just a recipe for problems to come up, right? In our house, we try the best we can to be fair to everyone, but let's be honest, as parents, there's times there is a favorite. It's the one who's obeying at that time, right? It's very true. You're like, that one's my favorite. Well, for whatever reason, and we know it's because of his relationship with Rachel, which we won't get into Rachel and Leah and all that beforehand, but he was in love with Rachel, and Joseph was his favorite, and he gives him this ornamental robe. Now, that's not going to be a problem, is it? The one son having this special robe, he's 17 years old and strutting around. So can you imagine how the other brothers are beginning to glare at him and go, "Oh man, you can just imagine the kind of anger that would begin to build up." Well, then he has a dream, and it gets even better. So it starts out, he's the favorite, and they don't like it, and then it says he had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Well, yeah, did you hear the dream? This is crazy. Listen to this dream. He said to them, now imagine if you're a brother and you tell your brothers this. He says, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright in the middle, while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it." Now, I don't know about you as a brother, but if you have brothers or sisters, can you imagine if at Thanksgiving your brother or sister comes and goes, "Guess what? I had a dream. You all were gathered around me and bowing down to me." Oh my, like you could just go, "Oh, this is not going to end well. This is not going to end well." Why, if you had this dream, would you share it? Sometimes God gives you a word that you just need to hold on to. That you don't need to smear all over the place. Sometimes God gives you something important and you need to hold on to it. I think there's an important verse in the New Testament where it says that Mary pondered all these things in her heart. It would have been really easy for her to go around going, "Hey guys, guess what? I'm going to have Jesus. This is the biggest thing ever." But for what God was about to do, she needed to ponder it in her heart. And we sometimes need to pray for discernment. What is a word for us? And what is a word for other people? There are times that we just need to shut our trap and allow God to work on our hearts. So he tells this other dream, and his brother said, "You intend to rule over us, you little twerp? Will you actually rule us?" And they're all looking at him like, "And you're wearing the multicolored robe. What is going on with you? You're having weird dreams. You got robes." This is not engendering some kind of love and respect from his brothers. When he told his father, so he tells his father the dream as well. He tells his brothers. His father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to you, to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So we know that, for a lot of our stories, we can identify with Joseph. Because at 17 years old, we are all about ourselves, right? The kind of the spotlight is on us. We think the world revolves around us. And there's a lot of us sometimes that we have that 17-year-old still inside of us. That we get offended if we don't get invited somewhere, or we When our name isn't spoken, we get frustrated. Let's be honest, it's human nature that we have this little 17-year-old inside of us that goes, look at me, I'm important. And we need to realize that that is part of who we are, but that's not where we need to end up. That's the beginning of the journey. Now see, Joseph is sold by his brothers. Now the next part is, he goes to find his brothers, and he had a little trouble finding them. He goes to Shechem, and they tell him they're actually near Dothan. So he gets to Dothan, and they see him, and it says in verse 18 of 37, it says, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of those dreams. Now see, it goes back to the dreams. It's like, because of what he said, it angered them, and they were going to get back at him. They wanted nothing to do with this. They were so mad that they were going to do something like to really kill him. And so Reuben heard this. He tried to rescue him. Let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him in the cistern in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue from him and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. What's the first thing they do? They strip him of the thing that he was kind of strutting around in. They took that away and said, you're just one of us. And then they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's just sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. You know, one important part of the story is the part where he's thrown in the cistern. I guarantee you, once he was stripped of his robe and thrown into the he lost a little bit of his pride. I guarantee you that being down in the well and looking up, things looked a little different than before. And sometimes God allows us to fall in a pit of either our own making or other people's making. In this case, it was a little bit of both, where his dad had treated him as a favorite, and it really he wasn't in control of his dad, but some of the things that his dad did led him to this place. But the second thing was his own actions led him to this place. And in that pit, there's no way that he could rescue himself. And the Bible tells us that really is the essence of Christianity. That it's not that we have everything together and that we can be good enough to rise out of the cistern, but it's that we acknowledge that we don't have it together. That we're broken and that we're in the bottom of the cistern, and that's where God meets us, in the bottom of the cistern. I want to tell you a couple stories of people that I met at the bottom of the cistern. One of them is my friend Neil Jordan. Neil was in my small group. Neil was a full-blown alcoholic. A lot of times when we met in a group, Neil would be half drunk and basically be argumentative in our small group settings. And there'd be people that would try to argue with him, and really we realized he had a problem. And so Lola, one of the small group members, and I went to his trailer and saw all the beer cans and all the stuff, and we began meeting with him. But he had to come to the place where he wanted to get help, and it took a while. It took several years actually, where he fell down, got to a bad place, and really emptied himself to the place where he realized, I can't do it anymore. Sobbing, crying. That's where I met Neil. The second family that I met was the Garners. The Garners were also in a different small group. They were split up. I didn't know that at the time when they were coming to a small group. But they had marital problems and some other things. When they came in, they were willing to study and meet other people. They were such a neat couple. They laughed and had fun. He was in construction. They had a wonderful son named Gabe. As I got to meet them, I got to eat food in their house, share life with them. And almost a year and a half after I met them, Gabe committed suicide. And that's how I met the Garners at the bottom of the well. There's times for each of us that we find ourselves at the bottom of the well, don't we? Amen. And we realize that in that moment, there's nothing we can do to find ourselves, like that we can really save ourselves. For me, it was being a minister for 17 years. It's almost been a couple years ago that I was at Monticello, and also a volunteer fireman and working at Walmart part-time. And kind of everything came off the wheels of my life, where first of all, things at the church were going south, and just some division and everything else, and I found myself having to get out of ministry. And you talk about doing something for 17 years where you really, this is my identity, and then one day you're not doing it anymore. I found myself in a pit. The second thing that happened was, and I won't get into all the details, but almost a year and a half ago, my wife left me. And it was difficult. It was tough for my kids and them for one day to be a dad and a husband and the next day not. That's how I find myself in a pit. My friend Neil, the Garners, myself, we've all been there. And yet in the pit, if you choose to, is where you can look up and realize that God is at work. We think of failure as usually something negative. But wise people know that they can take advantage of it. They learn from it. They use it as an education. Failure is actually one of the things that God uses in the university of life. Because the Bible tells us, as we read from Romans 6, is that God uses failure to build character in us. Mm-hmm. That if in the failure we turn and are mad at God, we're going in the wrong direction. But if we embrace God and hold on to Him in those moments, then they become learning experiences. You see, the Bible says in Proverbs, a man who refuses to admit his mistakes can never be successful. And we should know there are factors that come into our failures, but there's also our own weaknesses that play a part. If you're not making any mistakes, listen to this, you're not growing or learning. If you want to meet a really successful leader, ask them, what was your last failure? Because in those failures, it means you're risking something, that you're growing and you're learning. If you're not taking any risks, you're not really growing. You see, God gives us freedom from failure. And failure, if we see it not as the end game, but as a stumbling block, it can motivate us. You see, the Bible tells us sometimes, Proverbs says in verse 20, sometimes it takes a painful experience to make us change our ways. It's only when you feel the heat that you'll turn and move a direction. Isn't that true? Sometimes you just get in a rut, you get in a holding pattern, and it's only when God kind of shakes you and gets your attention to move you in a different direction. You see, Romans says it this way, we can rejoice when we run into problems and trials, for we know they are good for us. They help us to learn patience, and patience develops strength of character. You see, it makes us more mature people when we fall down, but when we ask for God's help. But this is not the end of the story, because we know from what happens that he's sold into slavery to the Midianites, and he becomes an associate of Potiphar's. And things don't turn out great there. We know that he has some problems because some of the things go really well, where he's an organizer, he's a manager, he makes things happen. But Potiphar's wife takes notice of him. And it says this: one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." And so Joseph is confronted by a temptation. And we need to realize that no matter where we are in life, that we're susceptible to temptations. And Billy Graham was the one who taught us that there's some safeguards we can have in our own lives. That we don't need to be alone with a woman by themselves. And we know in the sexualized culture that we stand in, there's people like Weinstein and Bill Cosby and all kinds of people that are now accused of things. And we need to realize that we need to put safeguards, because there's a lot of people watching, and you don't want to be in a place where it's he said, she said. And Joseph is in this place. What does he do? It says he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. He didn't entertain it. So he scored a C, okay, because he shouldn't have probably been there alone with her. But he didn't succumb to the temptation. So then what happens next is unfortunate. He did not sleep with her. But when the husband comes home, she tells him a fib and said, when his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." It said, "That Hebrew slave you brought us came home to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran into the house." So she told her own version of the story. And he has no witness to corroborate anything. And guess what? She's more powerful than he is. So he ends up in jail. Unjustly accused, unfairly jailed. He's in prison. And now this is another test that many of us will face. What are you going to do when life turns against you? Will you sit in that prison and blame everyone around you? Or will you become better? Because listen to what he does. It says that the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. So here's these two guys, and they have dreams. And it says that Joseph has the opportunity to listen to their dreams and tell them a story. And he said, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Now here's an important lesson that we need to get out of this, is that for many of us, when we go through difficult things, when unjust things are said to us, when people are against us, we can get bitter and just rail and gossip and get mad at the people around us. Or what Joseph, we can tell about his life, is that he had a dynamic relationship with God, even in prison. Even when he was unjustly put into prison, that he had this dynamic relationship with God, so that when these guys needed a dream, he had a daily walk with God. Do you allow God to speak to you even in the valleys, or only on the top of the mountain? Because what we learned from Joseph is that God works for the good of those who love him. And in grief and loss and even in imprisonment, we can still seek God with all of our heart. Amen. Now what happens is he interprets their dreams and he tells them, he says, to remember him. And kind of to fast forward to all this, it says the third day was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of the officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position. That was the dream that he had, that the cupbearer would be restored. But into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker. Now listen to this. Just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation. But here's the clinker. Look at verse 23 of verse 40. It says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. he forgot it. Now, I don't know about you, but if you were unjustly imprisoned and you just interpret these dreams, and this guy got out of prison and was restored, wouldn't you expect a little payback? Wouldn't you expect someone to remember you and to say, hey, Joseph interprets dreams, get him out of prison? Instead, we see from the verse, it says, he forgot him. He forgot him. Here's what I want you to realize, because later this is important, is that God was in control of this situation. Amen. That if he would have remembered him and got him out of prison, we have no idea how the rest of the story is. But at the time in which he was needed, that's when God released him out of prison. Amen. So sometimes you feel like, man, this ought to be happening, this door ought to open, this job ought to happen, this person ought to have a connection with me, and it's just not happening. You try to open the door and it's shut at every level, and realize you're in the same boat with Joseph. That Joseph tried to open the door and it was shut because God was on the other side keeping it shut. It will open in his time and not ours. Amen. We need to realize that. Now listen to how the rest of the story turns out, because the first part is his selfishness. The second part is his brokenness. And the last part, we're going to find out, is his service. You see, Joseph now has the opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Not the cupbearers, not his own dream, but now he's going to interpret a dream. Now listen to this. That will serve the entire country. You see, the first dream was about himself. But that isn't the dream that unlocks his potential and his destiny. The dream that will unlock who he is made to be will be about helping other people. Listen to this. Joseph has a dream, or Pharaoh has a dream, and in it, he was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, in chapter 41, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. Now to fast forward, he looks at all the land and asks the magicians and all the interpreters, and nobody can figure out the dream. They're looking at the dream and going, I have no idea. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer goes, oh, wait a minute, I remember a guy who interpreted a dream while I was in prison. And he said, bring him to me. And so Joseph comes to Pharaoh and interprets the dream. He said, it is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. There's going to be 7 years of abundance. And then there will be 7 years of famine. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it. In other words, there's no messing around. This is going to happen. And so, listen to this. So Pharaoh looks for a discerning and wise man to put him in charge of the land of Egypt. So he takes Joseph, and he says to Joseph in verse 39, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So here's Joseph at 17, bragging and full of himself, broken and empty and unjustly imprisoned. And yet God raises him up. Why? Why does God do this? Because he's not done with him. And for many of us, we have chapters in our life where we feel like we're not qualified to serve. We're not equipped to do what God has asked us to do. We don't have what we need to do what God's asked us to do. And what he tells us in this verse is that each of us has gifts and talents, and our past is a story that leads us to Jesus. You see, many people know the Bible story of Joseph and think about all the things that he did. And what we don't realize is how the story ends. And I want to finish with this last part here, because that's not the end of the story, because now his family gets involved and the story comes full circle. So there's a famine. Where does it also affect? It not only affects in Egypt, where Joseph is, but it affects back in Palestine, where Jacob and all his brothers are. So now they've heard that there's all this abundance. They have to go back. They have to go to Egypt. They have to go to the guy who's in charge of everything and ask for supply so that they can take it home. They meet with him. And this is an amazing thing. Here Joseph is with a different name. He literally dresses, and you remember the song Dress Like an Egyptian? Okay? He dresses like, you can't even tell this guy is a Palestinian. He looks completely like an Egyptian with the whole garb and everything. They didn't even know who he is when they meet him. And it says they go to him, and he plays this game, and there's this point at which, when he meets them, that he could have said, "I told you so." Imagine if you were thrown into a well and forgotten, and you meet them for the first time all these years later. He was 17 when he fell into a cistern. He's now 30. And he meets his brothers, and it would have been so easy to say, "Oh man, I got it over you. I'm the big boy in charge. Now you're going to bow down to me." But listen to what he says to them. He says in verse 45, Joseph could no longer control himself before all the attendants. He cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers, they couldn't answer. They were going, "What? This guy in charge of all of Egypt, he's our brother Joseph, who we left for dead?" There's a reason why they're not speaking. There's two things. Number one, they can't believe he's in charge of all Egypt, and he's dressed like he is, and he has a different name. That blows them away. But the second thing is, they're a little scared that he might be getting back at them for dumping him into a well. It says they were not able to answer him, listen to this, because they were terrified at his presence. They're going, "Oh boy, he's going to get back at us now." And Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And that's not how Egyptians treated Palestinians. But he said, when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. But it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by great deliverance. And so then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." And I love what he says in verse 50. He says, "What you intended for evil, God meant for good." Now this brings us to the end of our story, but I also want to finish with the little stories that I was telling you before, because Neil went through his rehab. He came out. It was not easy at all, but Neil cleaned up his apartment. He started to come to small group regularly. He switched his beer out for this gigantic tea thing that he would hold on to every small group. He was in church every Sunday. He poured his life into people around him. And I got to he died a couple years ago. When he died, Lola asked me, she said, I know you're not going to be able to get back, but can you record a message for the funeral? And I know that even though Neil experienced some of the hardest things, that wasn't the end of his story. The Garners witnessed the suicide of their son, and that could have been the end of their story, but it wasn't. They went through heartbreak and pain, and I got to witness a lot of it with them. But because of the death of their son, they got remarried. They ended up getting a bus, taking it to the high school where Gabe used to go, and they would pick up 15 to 20 kids and bring them to church. Since that time, several years ago, they have personally baptized over 20 kids because they poured their lives into them. You know, my story hasn't ended either, where, man, what God had taken away 5 years ago, I got the opportunity to, by the grace of God, become a manager at Walmart. It's been such an amazing journey to witness and to talk to people that I would never get the chance to if I were in a church. I see my kids all the time. I have a beautiful fiance. I have walked with God that whole time. You know, the truth is this, that our lives are not meant to be about ourselves, but they are about serving other people. Amen. That's what Joseph taught us. And when I take my kids and we visit someone in the hospital, or we go to feed at somewhere else where we've taken them to a homeless shelter and fed people, we all need to find areas where we can help other people, because that is the heart of the gospel. It's Joseph's story, but it's also our story. Let me pray. Father God, I thank you for the life of Joseph, that in him we can see our own story. We know that we're not perfect. We're broken people. We have chapters that just aren't everything it's supposed to be. But God, if we keep leaning into you and we love you, we know that we'll have an opportunity to bless other people. God, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I don't know where you're at this morning, but man, if you need prayer or if you have a decision to make, this morning we'll pray with you or talk with you. So as we close out, if there's anything you need at all, you can just ask the elders, ask me as we sing this last song. So.